One rainy night, the man stopped his car when he saw a small figure huddled on the side of the road, wet and silent. Little did he know that in just a few minutes, his life would change forever, because that little girl would know something he had never told anyone. Above, rain-drenched pine branches hung low, dripping steadily onto the rusted tin roof in a slow, rhythmic pattern. The night air over Willow Creek City felt like a thick, damp blanket, wrapping the whole town in the breath of the past. Eli Morgan drove quietly down the dirt road leading to his cabin, both hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the rain-speckled windshield. A short newscast had just ended, the announcer's voice still echoing faintly, but Eli had already turned off the radio. He didn't want to hear anything more. Spoken words in that moment only stirred something uncomfortable inside him. In the remaining silence, the swish of the wipers and the tires crunching softly over the wet road were enough. 10 minutes earlier, he had turned off the main highway, taking a winding back road that led toward the old pine forest. The trees on either side stood close together, like a thick curtain of time, bowing to whisper secrets only the patient could hear. His headlights cut a faint beam through the dark, glinting off scattered puddles like fading memories that hadn't yet dried. Eli had driven this path many times, but tonight, each bend, each patch of wet grass, made him feel as if he wasn't driving forward, but quietly returning to some distant place in his memory. From a shadowed corner of that memory, a vague image surfaced. A small bedroom with a pale pink blanket, crooked crayon drawings taped on the wall, and a faint voice, broken like a lullaby, interrupted mid-dream. Eli closed his eyes for a second, as if to stop that memory from rising, but when he opened them, his headlights had already caught sight of something that made his heart seize. A small figure huddled beside the road, tucked into the dark forest and the relentless rain. As the light passed over her, he slammed the brakes. The tires skidded over the slick dirt, and the car came to an abrupt stop. Eli opened the door and stepped out, feeling the cold slash through his jacket. The girl sat with her knees pulled to her chest, wearing a tattered gray t-shirt and clutching an old brown teddy bear, its fur worn thin at the ears. Her hair was plastered to her face with rain, and her thin legs trembled on the cold ground. She didn't cry, didn't call for help. Only when Eli approached did she lift her head. Her eyes were large, deep, looking at him with something both familiar and distant, as if she had seen him once in a dream she couldn't quite place. Eli knelt down, keeping his voice steady. "Are you lost?" The girl remained silent, lowering her head again as the rain continued to fall in gentle, deliberate drops through the leaves, like the slow breathing of the ancient forest. Eli removed his jacket, bent down and gently draped it over her shoulders, then lifted her into his arms as if afraid he might snap a fragile branch. She still didn't speak, but her arms tightened slightly around his neck, as though that motion had lived inside her memory, just waiting to be repeated. Back at the cabin, Eli carefully placed the girl onto an old fabric-covered wooden chair near the fireplace, where warmth was slowly spreading from glowing pieces of split wood. He crouched down to stoke the fire, carefully feeding it with pine logs he had dried weeks before. The flames took quickly, dancing in a thin veil of smoke. When he stepped into the kitchen to make hot cocoa, he could feel her eyes still watching him, wordless but full of cautious curiosity, like she was trying to memorize every move of this stranger who had just entered her life. He returned with a dry towel and handed it to her. "What's your name?" She took it, wiped her face, and whispered softly, almost as if she was talking only to herself. The name floated into the rainy night air so gently it felt like it might vanish, but instead it lingered, like a thread weaving quietly between two faraway moments. Eli sat down across from her, the warm cocoa cooling in his hands. His heart stirred, not out of pity, not out of duty, but more like he had silently stepped into an old scene where every detail felt familiar, though he couldn't remember ever having been there before. Outside, the rain continued to fall steadily, like a gentle lullaby from the earth and sky. Inside the worn wooden cabin, the fire flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls. The clock ticked in the background, steady like a breath held just beneath time. And the child's eyes never left Eli's, quiet eyes that seemed to have just let go of fear and picked up something older, more familiar than any home she had ever known. The next morning, the sky over Willow Creek City was neither quite rainy nor sunny. Droplets clung to the pine branches, falling slowly, one by one, as if they were listening closely to see if anyone had woken up after a long, silent night. Inside the small cabin nestled against the hillside, the fire in the hearth had just been rekindled with dry pine wood. The scent of burning resin drifted softly through the air, warm and tinged with something like quiet longing. Eli Morgan leaned forward to add more logs. His calloused hand brushed the cold edge of the iron stove, and in that instant, a memory flared up like a coal catching flame. Behind him, Sophie Blake stirred gently under a thick blanket. Her small figure remained curled up, clutching a worn teddy bear to her chest like a fragile shield. Her eyes opened just slightly, not the dreamy kind of waking, but cautious and measuring, as if she were testing whether what she saw was really real. Eli said nothing. He simply poured the still warm cocoa into an ivory ceramic cup and set it on the table beside the old love seat, next to a green leather-bound notebook worn at the edges. It had once belonged to Emily, his late daughter, a bright girl who loved to write and often jotted down her quiet thoughts in her signature slanted handwriting. Now the notebook sat waiting, its pages still and blank, yet somehow telling another story just the same. A few minutes later, the phone rang, its chime echoing through the stillness of the cabin. Eli picked it up. His voice was low, measured, each word chosen with care. On the other end was a representative from Child Protective Services, confirming they had received the report and would send someone to meet with him within the hour. He nodded softly, knowing they couldn't see him, and ended the call without saying anything more. Eli wasn't used to visitors, especially the kind who came with probing eyes and unspoken questions. Quietly, he washed another ceramic cup, wiped a thin layer of dust off the wooden chair near the hearth, and opened the small east-facing window, letting in the early mist to ease the still air. The cabin, though modest and small, was kept with care. Everything had its place. People who live alone long enough often develop a certain order, as if putting each item in the right spot might keep their memories from spilling out. Clara Del Bosque arrived right on time, bringing with her a calmness and quiet strength rarely seen in someone so young. She wasn't in uniform, just a warm, earth-toned sweater and low-heeled shoes. Simple, but not sloppy. Her face was bare, free of makeup, but her eyes were the kind that made people pause, as if hundreds of untold stories rested behind them. Clara didn't enter with urgency or protocol. She simply nodded at Eli, then let her gaze move slowly through the cabin as if reading a book she had once known well but forgotten until now. When she asked the girl's name, Sophie didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked silently toward Eli, as though waiting for an invisible kind of permission. Then she looked down. Clara gently lowered herself to sit on the wooden floor, placing herself at the same height as the child, without rush or pressure. "Do you like to draw?" Clara's voice was low, steady, like she was unlocking a door using only patience and warmth. Sophie didn't reply, but when Eli brought down a box of old crayons and a stack of blank paper from the shelf, the girl stepped forward, picked up a red crayon, and said nothing. The first picture was of a crooked house in the rain. The second showed a woman with long hair walking away. The third, an oversized hand pulling a little girl into the shadows. Clara made no comment. She glanced at Eli, then jotted a few quiet notes in her pad. Eli said nothing either, his eyes fixed on the bold, unsettling strokes, too intense for a child barely 5 years old. Sophie stood up, took a clean sheet of paper, and walked out onto the porch. She didn't look back at the two adults, just sat down quietly on the old weathered chair, bleached by sun and rain. Eli started to follow, but Clara held up her hand in a small gesture. Let her have her own space for a bit. Still, just minutes later, Sophie dropped a crayon onto the wooden floor. Eli walked out, picked it up, and gently placed it on the table beside her chair. As he turned to go, Sophie's tiny hand touched the back of his, just for a second. She didn't look away, and the touch wasn't accidental. Eli sat down on the porch steps beside her, silent. The air between them wasn't heavy, but it wasn't light enough to be called peaceful either. After a moment, Sophie handed him another drawing. It was of a broad-shouldered man carrying a child through black smoke and red flames. The child's face was carefully drawn. The man's was left blank. Eli stared at the paper. "Did you draw this?" Sophie slowly nodded, her eyes never breaking from his. There was no fear left in them now, only a quiet caution, deeply human, like someone learning how to trust again. Eli looked at her. Her eyes, still so clear, held a silent gratitude, and in that moment he saw it. The first smile, small, faint, but real. A fragile spark, strong enough to shake something loose inside him. He didn't say another word. He just sat beside her, hand resting lightly on the arm of the weathered chair, beside a child who spoke through trembling lines on paper. Each drawing was like a door, opening into the deeper layers of feeling that words couldn't reach. From the distance, the mist still hung among the pines. Like it too was listening quietly to a new chapter being written. As Clara gathered her things to leave, she turned to Sophie, then to Eli. She doesn't need to say anything yet, but what she's drawn tells us she's still here, still feeling, still waiting for someone to truly hear her. Eli nodded, and as Clara stepped through the doorway, he added softly, "Maybe I am too." That afternoon, Sophie didn't nap. She pulled the small wooden chair close to the window, where the soft light filtered through the mist like a whisper from the sky. She kept drawing, one page after another, as if each stroke of the crayon was a step back home. Sometimes it was the silhouette of a figure deep in the forest, sometimes a glowing porch light, and sometimes a hand reaching through the rain, no name, no face, but somehow strong enough to hold on to a small, wandering soul. Eli didn't interrupt. He just handed her more blank pages, then sat across from her and opened Emily's old journal. The penciled letters in that slanted, childlike handwriting were still clear. "Daddy, don't stay up working too late. I dreamed you got lost in the smoke." A soft breeze flipped the page. Eli blinked, drawn out of memory. Across the room, Sophie was focused on another drawing. This time she had added a new figure, a man sitting beside her. His face was still undefined, but his presence was unmistakably familiar. Behind them, the porch light glowed like a quiet promise through the thickening mist. Eli smiled, not because of the drawing, but because of what it didn't say aloud. On the tin roof of the cabin, hidden deep in the pine woods, raindrops left over from the night before fell in uneven rhythms. The sound wasn't loud. It was more like someone gently tapping on old memories, trying to awaken the things people usually choose to forget. Farther out, beyond the mist-covered silence, a forest bird sang a short tune, then went quiet again, as if even nature itself was hesitant to disturb the stillness. In the small kitchen, the wood stove still held a faint warmth, and slivers of light danced softly on the worn gray walls. Eli Morgan stood by the sink, rearranging two simple ceramic mugs. One had a fine crack near the rim, the other had darkened over time from long use. He didn't replace them, not because he was frugal, but because he had a habit of keeping things others might consider useless. Sophie Blake remained seated in the corner of the room, clutching a threadbare teddy bear in her arms, her gaze drifting to the window where the mist still hung so thick that even the row of pines behind the cabin couldn't be seen. She hadn't said a word since morning, but there was no fear in her eyes. A car pulled into the yard, making the entire cabin vibrate slightly. Eli stood up and gently pulled the curtain aside. It was the car of Dr. Walter Green, a former military medic who now volunteered as the town's community doctor. He didn't carry a large medical bag, just a small, weathered brown case, decorated with faded symbols sewn into the leather. The cabin door opened softly. Clara Del Bosque stepped in with Dr. Green. Sophie glanced up briefly, then looked back down at her teddy bear, as silent as before. "You must be Sophie, right?" Dr. Green sat down beside her, his voice deep and warm, never forceful. Sophie nodded slightly. He didn't start with any difficult questions. Instead, he pulled a small dog-shaped cookie from his coat pocket and held it out to her. "Do you like cookies shaped like animals? I bet the doctor you saw before didn't know how to make cat-shaped ones like I do." Sophie didn't smile, but her hand reached out and took the cookie. From a distance, Eli watched her every movement, one hand resting on the back of the chair. The examination unfolded in gentle silence. When Sophie removed her jacket so the doctor could check her basic reflexes, Dr. Green paused for a moment. His expression shifted. It wasn't shock, but something much more, still. His hands didn't stop, only became more delicate. "Does anything hurt?" he asked in a soft voice. Sophie shook her head, unflinching, unafraid. Across her upper back, shoulders, and wrists were old scars. Not fresh, not bleeding, but etched deep, as if someone had once drawn on her skin with lines that could never be erased. Clara saw them, Eli saw them, but neither said a word. Eli turned away, his jaw tightening, his fingers curled into a fist, nails pressing into his palm until it turned white. But when Sophie finished putting her shirt back on, it was Eli who stepped forward, quietly tugging her sleeve down to straighten it. No words were needed, just one small gesture, like an apology for not having come sooner, for not having stopped what had already happened. Dr. Green closed his notebook and exchanged a look with Clara. No diagnosis was spoken aloud in front of Sophie, and no promises were made that things would be okay. That evening, the rain returned in a soft drizzle. The mist cleared a little, revealing scattered patches of light among the trees in the yard. Eli didn't go to bed. Instead, he sat in the small woodworking shed beside the cabin, where sawdust still covered the floor from the half-finished bench he had been building weeks ago. He opened an old wooden chest on the table, the one he had once made for Emily. It was still there, coated in a thin layer of dust, with floral carvings that had never been completed. His fingers ran across the wood, tracing each groove like retracing the lifelines of a forgotten past. He picked up a cloth and began to wipe the surface. Under the dim yellow light, the dust lifted gently like mist. A draft slipped through a crack in the door, bringing in the smoky, damp scent of wet timber, the same smell from that night, the night when a small body had coughed in his arms, eyes wide in the smoke. It was the same look Sophie had that morning. No one had taught him how to hold a child who had been abandoned. No one had shown him how to be a father again when his heart had long since closed. But that night, as the wind moaned through the door like a sigh from the past, he kept wiping until the wood gleamed, because he knew no matter how many years had passed, a chest once made for a child still deserved to be finished. In the living room, Sophie had already fallen asleep, still holding her teddy bear beside her. The blanket draped over her was slightly crooked, as if someone had tried to cover her but stopped halfway. Clara had gone, leaving behind a small note on the table, nothing more than one line. Some children don't need explanations. They just need someone who stays. Eli read the note, then placed it inside the chest, among the scent of wood and the yellow glow of a cold night, while the forest mist still refused to lift. It had been 3 days since the doctor examined Sophie. Now the early autumn wind slipped quietly through the old pine trees, rustling fallen leaves across the wooden porch of Eli Morgan's cabin. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the misty light was enough to cast a shadow of the bench on the porch. In the kitchen, the kettle gurgled. Eli rose from the table, poured hot water into a tea mug, and walked back to the window. The forest in front of him still looked half asleep. Shafts of pale golden light filtered through the trees. He took a deep breath. The scent of damp pine wood mixed with the warm steam gave off a feeling that was both unfamiliar and oddly comforting. A soft sound rose behind him, like the wind gliding across the wooden floor. Sophie appeared silently at the doorway, her hair tousled, fluttering slightly in the breeze. In her hand was an old cleaning rag. She didn't say hello, didn't look for permission. Her steps were slow, deliberate, heading toward Eli. He didn't move, didn't turn around, didn't seem surprised. Together, they stepped behind the cabin to where an old chest lay in the slanting morning light, waiting to be finished like a memory left undone. Eli bent down and began reapplying varnish to the chest's surface. Sophie whispered, as if talking to herself, "I once dreamed about you. There was fire, red light, and smoke, but you didn't run away." Eli's hand froze. He turned to look at her, but Sophie didn't meet his eyes. She continued, wiping wood shavings from the edge of the chest, her movements oddly slow and careful. "I remember someone carrying me out of the fire," she murmured. her gaze still on the grain of the old wood. "I think it was you." Eli fell silent. Memories he thought long buried surged forward. He remembered that day clearly, red flames devouring the sky above the old military camp. In the split second between life and death, he had rushed into a collapsing room and carried out a girl wrapped in a soaked blanket. After the fire, no one came to claim her. As a firefighter, he couldn't keep her, even though her eyes haunted him for years. Clara Del Bosque stood silently in the workshop's doorway, her figure blended into the wooden frame, as if she'd been there for a long time. She didn't enter or speak, she simply observed, her gaze still and deep, like a calm lake where every emotion could reflect without words. Sophie washed her hands, dried them, and stepped outside without looking back. Eli stood up, about to follow, when he noticed something small in his hand, a stone, its edge charred black. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Eli sat alone in his workroom. He unlocked a metal cabinet and pulled out a yellowed file folder, its corners scorched. Inside were reports from the fire, pictures from the scene, and one old photograph. Him, in full firefighting gear, cradling a child wrapped in a silver blanket. That child was Sophie. He looked at the small bed in the corner where Sophie now slept soundly, her teddy bear pressed to her chest, her breathing even. Her face tugged at his heart. It looked startlingly like Emily, his late daughter. But it wasn't a replacement. It was something sent to him from a place he hadn't dared believe in. He held the stone tight in his hand. Its rough surface felt like a scar, something that had survived a burn and remained quiet for too long. But when he closed his eyes, he could hear it, not with his ears, but from the hollow places in his chest, the sound of fire rising, and a voice, fragile as morning mist, whispering through memory, "Please, don't leave me." Just before midnight, Clara sent him a message. Memories don't always live in the mind. Sometimes they stay in the palm of your hand, in a sketch, or in a silence that stretches on. Eli read it again and again. He didn't reply, but when he left the workroom and walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, he found Sophie drawing. On the white page was a wooden cabin, a dark-haired man carrying a little girl through fire. Some truths, when they reach the heart, don't need confirmation, you just know. Eli sat down on the porch bench, the blackened stone still in his hand. The porch light remained on, the wind still whispered, and inside him, the old fire wasn't pain anymore, it was direction. That little girl had found her way home, and he finally understood why he had survived. The next morning, the sun rose late. Thin gray clouds hovered above the rooftops of Willow Creek City like floating veils. Eli decided to take Sophie for a walk through the weekend market. She walked beside him, still clutching the burned stone as if it held a piece of memory she couldn't let go. On the way, they stopped at the Southview Bakery. The scent of warm bread filled the air, and the bell above the door chimed like a familiar greeting. Mrs. Helen Whitaker bent down and handed Sophie a sugar doll cookie. "For Eli's daughter," she smiled. "You look brighter today than last time." Eli smiled and nodded in gratitude. Sophie didn't say anything, but she hugged the cookie tightly, then looked up at Eli with a hesitant expression, as if she wanted to ask something but changed her mind. As they left, they ran into Clara, who was carrying a basket full of apples. She stopped and teased, "A special guest in town must be the reason you're finally at the market." Eli looked a little awkward, but Sophie reached out and took Clara's hand, pointing at the apple basket and smiling. "Miss Clara, can you draw me?" she asked. Clara laughed. "I'm not very good at drawing, but if you lend me a crayon, I'll try." The three of them stood in the middle of the lively market, where the sounds of life rose like a familial symphony. Vendors called out, children ran past, and old bolero tunes played from a crackling loudspeaker. Amid it all, no one mentioned the past, but each of them, in their own way, still carried it, like breath, like the quiet rhythm of a heart that never disappeared. That night, Sophie placed the stone on the windowsill. She whispered, "If it rains tomorrow, maybe it will finally tell the story it's been holding." Eli didn't fully understand, but he didn't ask. Sometimes a child understands the world better than adults, and sometimes a small stone can hold an entire fire in its heart. The night passed quietly like a gentle stream running through deep woods. No sirens, no smoke, just the hush of wind and the sound of a heart beating. In that stillness, a new chapter was unfolding, not loudly, but full of hope. Heavy sheets of gray clouds hung low over the sky above Willow Creek City, as if the entire town were holding its breath, waiting for something to be revealed. The scent of dew seeped through every crack in the wooden doors, slipping along the worn walls of the police station, where reports sat unfiled in piles next to the printer, and forgotten cups of coffee still released quiet tendrils of steam. A wall clock ticked unevenly, its rhythm offbeat, as though even time itself hesitated in the face of the truth about to surface. Inside the small office of the station, the pale fluorescent lights made the documents look even more yellowed. Captain Helen Whitaker leaned slightly forward, her eyes fixed on the screen of an old desktop, one hand resting over a frayed copy of a case file. Deputy Noah Brooks stood beside her, gripping a freshly printed housing registry list, the paper still warm from the printer. No one spoke, but the air had turned thick the moment the name Melissa Grant appeared clearly on the list, next to an old address near the edge of the forest, an address once reported for foul odors and the sound of crying children during rainy nights. Richard Turner, convicted of insurance fraud in Puebla in 2018, then wanted again for failing to pay child support in Sinaloa. Noah said under his breath, his eyes faltering for a moment. Helen gently closed the file, tapping the desk with her fingers as if weighing her next move. "We need to speak with the landlord, the grocer, and the liquor store owner. Keep it quiet. Bring the recorder, and make sure no one sees you." Together, Helen and Noah headed to James Carter's grocery store. When they arrived, James was calmly restocking old boxes of instant noodles behind the counter. The wind chime above the door jingled softly, signaling the arrival of customers. Upon seeing Helen walk in, he looked up and gave a slow nod, as if he had been expecting her. His eyes rested quietly on the shining badge pinned to her chest. "I'll tell you what I know, ma'am," he said, his voice deep and steady, without a trace of fear. "She came by twice, once for a box of milk, once for a SIM card, but it was the man with her that made me uneasy. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at me, like he was warning me to mind my own business." Next was Mrs. Martha Doyle, the owner of a rundown boarding house at the slope of Southview Street. She was a thin, wiry woman, her white hair tangled like storm clouds caught in barbed wire, but her eyes still held the kind of light only those who had seen too much could carry. Room 3. Every rainy night, I'd hear a child crying. Not loud, not long, but just enough to keep me awake. I heard it clearly, but I was scared. They always paid on time, never made trouble. I pretended not to hear. To be honest, I didn't have the courage to open that door. In a place like this, sometimes it's best to act deaf and blind. Frank Delgado, the liquor store owner, didn't need many questions. Silently, he opened a drawer below the counter, pulled out an old USB stick, and plugged it into the computer. The screen blinked a few times, then played a video captured by the security camera near the register. It was pouring rain. The streetlight's reflection shimmered off the windshield of an old pickup truck. Richard Turner appeared, face hidden beneath a hood, opened the rear door, and pulled a little girl out. He placed her in the front passenger seat, shut the door, and walked away without looking back once. Sophie Blake sat motionless, her small eyes quietly watching the rain streak down the window like fractures in memory. She didn't resist. She didn't cry. She was just a small figure in the middle of a storm, carrying a heartbreaking silence that spoke of resignation. Eli Morgan didn't even realize when he had arrived outside the store. His hands were deep in his coat pockets, eyes not on the screen, but simply listening to the rain echo from the small speaker. Helen stepped outside. She didn't speak right away. After a long pause, she handed him the printed images from the video. "That's the girl? That's Sophie," she said, her voice low and calm, but in Eli's mind, it was an explosion, not of guns or fire, but of memory. Memories of soot-blackened hands, scorched hair, and a whimper he had once held against his chest. No one said anything else. Their eyes met in silence, needing no further explanation. Helen clutched the folder tighter and gave a small nod. "Come with me. We need to go there now." At the entrance of the forgotten storage, the rusty iron door groaned faintly as Helen pushed it open. The padlock swung loose, as if no one had ever truly meant to return. Eli stepped inside first. His flashlight beam swept across the moldy wooden floor, dust rising in clouds. In the center of the room was a blackened burn mark, still jagged, like a memory that hadn't yet healed. On the wall, a crescent of soot marked the place where someone had once rested their head. There were no bloodstains, only the slow drift of cold ash in the air, and a silence so thick it felt like trespassing into someone else's pain. Helen gently laid her hand against the wall, her fingers tracing the brittle soot. Eli stood frozen, saying nothing, but in his eyes, under the dim light, one could almost see the outline of a little girl, curled in a corner, clutching a worn-out teddy bear, eyes wide open, waiting for someone to come back, but too afraid to hope. He stepped outside slowly. Inside his chest, something felt heavy and bitter, as if he himself had once been left behind in that very room. Not physically, but in memory, as if a part of his soul had stayed behind in that rainy night years ago. After leaving the warehouse, Eli took Sophie to the town's bookstore. She stood silently at the children's section, staring at an illustrated book about firefighters. She flipped through the pages without a word, then stopped at a picture of a fireman carrying a child from the flames and whispered, "He came back, even when it was burning." Standing behind her, Eli touched the back of his neck, steadying himself. A chill ran down his spine, not from fear, but from something ancient rising again. He pressed his lips together, hesitant, then said nothing. That sentence needed no response, because it wasn't a question. It was truth, raw and gentle. She had known, probably for a long time, even before he had dared to face it himself. That afternoon, Sophie drew a new picture. Eli found it while cleaning up the dining table. In it was a wooden house glowing with light, a chest, and a faceless man knocking gently on a heart with his bare hand. For the first time in many years, Eli sat down at the drawing table, not to correct or sketch, but simply to listen. He placed his hand on the picture, as if trying to hear the quiet knocking rising from deep within his chest, a persistent, tender rhythm, like the beating of something that had never been named. That morning, the sky over Willow Creek City hung heavy with a dense, gray stillness, as if nature itself were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. Rain from the night before still clung to the cold metal railings lining the courthouse steps. The thick, tall walls, silent and stark, seemed accustomed to hearing lies, muffled sobs, and quiet resignation. But today, everything was silent, as if the entire building were waiting for a truth to finally be named. In courtroom number 3, fluorescent lights cast their sterile glow over each row of seats. The smell of old paper, varnished wood, and the ink of filed indictments blended into an atmosphere thick and unpleasant. Yet no one complained, because not everyone had come to listen. Some had come to witness. Others came hoping for forgiveness, and some were there simply because they had nowhere else to be. Melissa Grant sat in the defendant's seat. She wore a black leather jacket, freshly polished heels, and lipstick of vivid red, as if to draw a line between herself and the rest of the world. Her eyes fixed on nothing and no one, drifting forward as if somewhere ahead still held a future she believed she deserved. Next to her sat Richard Turner. He didn't bother with a suit, just a wrinkled shirt and a perpetual squint that made him look like he was mocking the entire courtroom. His right hand tapped rhythmically on the wooden table, each knock sounding like an unspoken challenge to everyone around. "Is that all you've got? What makes you better than me?" The prosecutor stepped forward. Her voice wasn't loud, but each word was sharp, like a blade. The defendant, Richard Turner, in collusion with Melissa Grant, the biological mother of Luna Esquivel Grant, staged a fake accident in order to commit insurance fraud, then abandoned the child in severe weather conditions in Whispering Pines Forest, hoping the girl would not survive to reveal their crime. Melissa gave a slight shrug. Richard chuckled softly, like he'd just heard a joke at a bar. He turned to the judge, his tone even and mocking. "She's still alive, isn't she? What else do you people want? A medal for the washed-up firefighter who found her?" Eli Morgan entered the courtroom like a gust of cold wind. He wore a worn gray coat, arms wrapped tightly around a thick file. Without a word, he nodded to the prosecutor and stepped forward, placing 2 items on the table. a black USB drive, and an old silver voice recorder. Eli's voice was deep but steady. This device was discovered while I was cleaning out the old fire truck from Station 7, where I used to serve. It was attached beneath the driver's seat, near the fuse box. The USB contains audio recordings captured by the truck's internal system right before the engine fire. The video's gone, but the audio remained intact. Eli didn't sit down, he stood, eyes fixed on the small screen flickering to life in the middle of the room, a screen where justice would finally have its turn to speak. From the speakers, a man's voice emerged. The face was gone, but the venom in his words was unmistakable. "You open your mouth to anyone, and I'll leave you out there again. Who do you think you are, huh? Nobody wants you. Even your mother thinks you're a burden." Captain Helen Whitaker and Deputy Noah Brooks handed the judge additional evidence. Recorded testimonies from James Carter, the corner store owner, Mrs. Martha Doyle, the former landlord, and Frank Delgado, the liquor store clerk. The courtroom fell silent, drained of sound. Somewhere in a back corner, a stifled sob rippled through the air, shaking the stillness like a tremor. Richard narrowed his eyes. He sneered. "So what if I said that? I was teaching the kid a lesson. I'm the stepdad. I have that right. Or are you people going to outlaw yelling at kids now, too?" The prosecutor didn't respond. She simply signaled for Clara Del Bosque, the social worker, to approach. Clara presented the medical evaluation from Dr. Walter Green, along with photographs of Luna's old bruises on her back and shoulders, and copies of the girl's drawings of a warehouse, a towering figure, and arms wrapped in flames. "We've confirmed," Clara said, "that Luna drew these images following a nightmare. She clearly remembers the light of the vehicle, the smell of smoke, and someone holding her tightly when she believed she was disappearing." Richard rolled his eyes. Melissa scoffed. "Great imagination she's got. Or maybe Mr. Morgan taught her how to dream like that." The judge ignored the sarcasm. His gaze lowered to the folder before him, his voice deep but firm. "The evidence is undeniable. Richard Turner is sentenced to 20 years in prison without parole. Melissa Grant is sentenced to 14 years, with review possible after the first year. This court is adjourned." The gavel struck, shattering the last illusion in the room. Richard shot up, ready to speak, but two officers stepped in immediately. He growled, "You think this is over? That little girl's as fake as this whole town." Melissa said nothing, but as she passed by Eli, she turned her head and whispered coldly, "You think you're a hero? That kid's not even yours." Eli didn't respond. He only placed a hand over his chest, the same spot that once held a trembling child in the middle of the coldest night he could remember. Moments later, the courtroom was empty, save for vacant chairs, scattered paperwork, and pale overhead lights. Eli stood in silence, staring at the blank screen. He felt no victory, no triumph, only a stillness, like the surface of a lake after the wind stops blowing. Then he turned, each step heavy but certain. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift. Far away, in a small cabin nestled on the edge of Whispering Pines Ridge, Sophie Blake sat on the floor playing with a piece of colored paper. She had no idea that justice had just spoken on her behalf, and this time it had chosen to stand with the small, the silent, and the brave. It had been 3 days since the trial ended. Morning light filtered through the maple leaves in front of the cabin, speckling the faded wooden floor like traces of old paint left behind by time. The air after the rain carried the scent of damp soil, decaying bark, and sharp pine resin. Everything in the forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to be cleansed or to begin again. Out back, the clothesline swayed gently in the breeze. Towels, quilts, and Eli's shirts still dripped faintly, the last signs of the storm that had passed 3 days earlier. The wind passed beneath the eaves, making the wind chime by the door ring softly like a whisper from memory. The cabin felt brighter than usual, not just because sunlight was slipping through the sheer curtains, but because something inside was slowly shifting, as if the house itself was ready to open to something new. On the living room floor, between stacks of half-colored drawings and scattered crayons, Sophie Blake sat curled up, carefully shading in the edges of an unfinished picture. Her old stuffed bear lay beside her, tilted as if it too were helping her draw something secret. Eli Morgan stood at the kitchen threshold, holding a cup of black coffee long gone cold. The steam had faded, but the faint bitterness still hung in the air. He said nothing, made no move to interrupt. He just quietly watched the little girl bent over her drawing, her gaze so focused that the rest of the world seemed to disappear. In that moment, peace wasn't about silence, but about witnessing something simple and honest take place without needing to explain it. On the floor were her newest pictures. One showed a man standing in the middle of a blaze, his body fiercely shielding a small figure curled in a blanket. The man's face was hidden behind smoke and crimson flames. Another, full of color, depicted two children in a golden-purple garden, one painting on a wooden wall, while the other danced with arms outstretched as if trying to catch sunlight. In the bottom corner, written in wobbly but firm handwriting, Emily. Eli didn't touch the drawings, but his thumb pressed harder against the cup, as though trying to hold down a swell rising in his throat. Sophie finished coloring the last strokes, then slowly placed the crayon down. Her eyes left the page and turned toward the hallway. There, an old door covered in dust, its gray handle worn and scratched by time, sat quietly closed, like a memory sealed off. No one had touched that door in 3 years. It was as if they were all afraid that opening it would let the past flood back into the house. Eli stepped away from the kitchen, still loosely holding the cold cup. He walked slowly down the hallway, each step seeming to measure out the 3 years that had passed. When he reached the door, he paused, his shoulders sinking slightly, as if weighed down by something long carried. He turned his head, and behind him, Sophie was standing, her drawing pressed tightly against her chest like it was the only thing she could bring with her into a place that had never been hers. Her eyes found his, not waiting, not avoiding, just meeting. Eli slowly raised his hand, his fingers brushing the chipped paint of the doorknob. He turned it gently, and the door creaked open with a soft sound, like a sigh that had been buried in the chest of someone who had stayed silent for too many years. Inside, the room was small, but full of little things that had once belonged to someone. Gentle light filtered through cream-colored curtains, falling on a single bed covered with a pale pink blanket. The pillow still held a faint crease, like the girl who once slept there had just stepped out for a moment. In one corner stood a low bookshelf filled with thin, colorful books, stacked crookedly. A stuffed animal missing one eye lay on its side inside a fabric bin. The wall displayed a few faded drawings, clouds with wings, a house with pink ballet slippers. Sophie stepped into the room first, unhurried but steady, as if she already knew exactly where she was going. She walked past the bed, gently placed her new drawing on the floor near the footboard, then moved toward a wooden chest in the corner. The chest was unfinished, still holding the scent of freshly cut pine. Its lid had no handle yet, and the edges remained rough with saw marks, but the body had been carefully joined with firm wooden joints. Along the side, small grooves had been carved into the shape of stars, some crooked, some straight, as if a child's hand had once tried to recreate the night sky from memory. She sat on the floor and traced her fingers over one of the lopsided stars. Then she turned to look at Eli, saying nothing. Her gaze held no surprise, only calm recognition, as if she had always known the chest had been waiting for her. Eli stepped into the room, careful not to touch anything. He opened a small wooden box on the shelf. Inside were a few old items, a stubby colored pencil, a faded purple hair tie, and a red wool bracelet frayed with time. He handed the bracelet to Sophie. She accepted it with both hands, studied it for a moment, then quietly slipped it onto her wrist like it was something she had always done. "There used to be a little girl who lived here," Eli said softly, his voice more like he was speaking to himself than to her. "She loved to draw, just like you." He didn't tell a story or explain anything. He just let the words out, like a truth that had been still for so long, it finally found its own way to the surface. Sophie nodded, then stood. She walked slowly around the room, her eyes taking in every detail, as if she were listening for the faint breath of whatever still lingered there. She paused in front of the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines. Stopping on a book with a torn cover, she looked up at a faded photo hanging crooked on the wall, her expression neither sad nor joyful, just open, like she was taking in something she already knew. Finally, she returned to stand beside Eli. They didn't look at each other. They simply stood, each with their own quiet space, but not alone. The light touched them gently, like a soft blanket draped across their shoulders, not to warm, not to chill, just to remind them they were seen. As they left the room, Sophie glanced back and laid one hand on the doorframe. "I'm not afraid of that room," she said, her voice soft like leaves brushing in the wind outside the porch. It wasn't a declaration or a comfort, just a feeling rising quietly from her chest. Eli paused, then nodded. His eyes no longer held hesitation, nor full sorrow. It was the look of someone ready to open the door, not just to memory, but to something new, asking for space in a long-closed heart. He didn't shut the door, just nudged it gently so it stayed ajar, letting the light find its way in each morning. On the living room table, Sophie's unfinished drawing still rested. It looked as if it, too, was waiting for something to be said. In the picture, a small cabin sat tucked under blazing red maple trees, its wooden porch humble and warm. A yellow lamp above the door glowed softly, not just illuminating the path, but casting a light that seemed to whisper, "This place, once lonely, now waits for someone to come home." The morning at the cabin began in a quiet that was smooth as glass. The early wind slipped through the maple branches like a gentle hand brushing against memory, leaving a soft echo on the blanket of red leaves covering the porch. The small cabin stood unchanged, but something in the air felt different, as if it were waiting for a whisper or the quiet sound of footsteps to break the sacred stillness of the morning. In that morning hush, the steady rhythm of a handsaw could be heard. Eli Morgan leaned forward, his boots planted firmly on the ground, his hands pushing each motion through the straight maple plank already measured and marked. The dry wood was light but resilient. He was building a bench, not for any specific reason, just an idea that came to him the night before when Sophie had sat on the front steps, her back against the door, her head resting against her teddy bear. Maybe a bench wide enough to hold them both would be better. Footsteps rustled lightly through the dry leaves. Mr. Walter Green, the town's old carpenter, had arrived at some point unnoticed. He wore a thick-knit sweater, a worn ball cap, and held a whittling knife dulled from years of use. "You need one more slat for the back," he said without greeting, "so someone leaning back won't feel like the world's missing behind them." Eli gave a small nod, his eyes still on the unfinished wood. Mr. Green understood without needing more. He stepped closer, sat down beside Eli, pulled out his blade, and carefully shaved down a sliver of maple. His hand didn't shake. Each cut was clean and precise. Once the piece fit perfectly, he pressed it into place, then tapped it gently, like a father fixing a child's coat. "Now it's a real place to lean." Sophie appeared at the doorway, holding a jar of pale brown paint. Her hair hung loose like soft ash. She didn't ask. She simply sat down and began brushing the slats. Each stroke was slow and steady. No one urged her, no one hurried. Eli watched them both for a moment, then quietly turned back to his task. While drilling holes for the bolts, he asked softly, "Where do you think this bench should go?" Sophie looked up, under the maple tree, where the light from the porch still reaches. Eli tilted his head. "Why there?" She tilted her head too, her eyes glancing toward the porch. "So anyone passing by can sit down. It's cooler under the tree, and if you can still see the house, you won't feel left behind." By afternoon, the bench was finished. Eli carved a line into the backrest. "For those who were once forgotten, and those who choose to remember for them." Without a word, Sophie laid her hand on the wood as if leaving a print. Mr. Green stood silent for a moment, then said, "It's not just a bench anymore. It's an invitation." The next day, townspeople began to stop by. No one had been invited. No one was expected. But one by one they came. Mrs. Helen Whitaker brought a tray of small, sweet pastries and set them on the table next to the bench. She didn't sit right away. She just stood there for a long moment, gently twisting the cloth in her hands. The Miller family brought a pot of purple asters and placed it beneath the maple. They didn't ask why. They just smiled and said, "This tree fits the season." A few elderly folks tried sitting on the bench. They patted the wood gently, then stood again. A little boy ran by, climbed up onto the seat, then jumped down, giggling. Eli stood in the porch's shade, holding a mug of cold coffee, watching. He didn't explain. He didn't say who made the bench. He simply stood still, like a quiet keeper of something that had begun to grow again. Sophie sat on the steps, drawing. On the paper, the bench appeared beneath the maple's red canopy, beside the porch light's warm glow, and a stream of small figures like autumn leaves drifting past, touching and disappearing. As the light slanted through the trees in the late afternoon, casting a golden haze, Eli walked out and sat beside Sophie. "What are you drawing?" "A place where you don't need to ask if you're welcome." He didn't answer, only looked toward the bench where someone was sitting silently, their hand resting on the wood like they were talking to a memory. Sometimes healing doesn't come from words. Sometimes it comes from a place to sit down and breathe. The bench didn't fix anything, but it made people stop. And sometimes that's enough. The night sky hung heavy, like a thin, soaked blanket draped over the hill where the wooden cabin stood quietly among the pines. Rain fell gently, not in sheets, but in soft drizzles, like sighs slipping down from the frozen clouds above. The wind didn't howl, it whispered through the trees, like a careful hand turning the pages of long-forgotten memories. The warm yellow porch light stayed on through the night. No one turned it off. Early the next morning, Ellie woke in silence. He had slept deeply, without dreams, without restlessness. It was a kind of sleep he hadn't had in years, calm and whole, like something inside him had finally stopped struggling in the dark. He stepped into the kitchen. The small space smelled faintly of damp pine and fresh coffee. On the wooden table by the window, his usual morning spot, was a freshly poured cup of coffee. Beside it lay a pale yellow envelope. No name, just two simple words, scribbled in pencil. Para Papa. Eli stood still for a long time, staring at the envelope. He picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly as emotion squeezed tightly around his chest. Inside was a wax crayon drawing. A large, red blaze took up nearly the entire page, but what Eli couldn't take his eyes off was the small image in the center. A man holding a little girl in his arms, shielding her from the flames. The man's face wasn't twisted in fear or pain. He was smiling. On the back of the paper, written in shaky, childlike handwriting, were the words, "Gracias por volver. Te quiero, papá." Eli sank into his chair. He cried, not from grief, but because he had been forgiven. The door creaked softly open. Sophie stood there, clutching her worn-out stuffed bear. She wore the navy blue sweater Eli had mended for her the week before, a little too big, but warm. "You saw it," Eli said, his voice cracking. Sophie didn't speak. She nodded and stepped closer, placing her small hand gently on his. Her eyes were clear, no longer afraid like they once were, and no longer hesitant like in those early nights. "I think if you were my dad, you'd understand," she whispered. Eli leaned down, touching his forehead to hers. "I do," he said softly. They didn't need any more words. A few minutes later, a knock broke the quiet moment. Clara Del Bosque, the social worker, stood at the door with her calm eyes and her brown hair tied neatly behind her head. "Good morning," she said, her voice light as music drifting through the fog. In her hands was a thick file, sealed and official. "I have good news. The court approved it. Starting today, Sophie is officially your adopted daughter." Eli didn't open the folder. He simply nodded, and a quiet smile crept to the corners of his eyes. "We've been a family for a while now, Clara." She smiled back and didn't say another word. That afternoon, the rain continued to fall, but it wasn't cold. It felt soft, like a mother's hand brushing the hair of her daughter. In the living room, the fire blazed warmly, casting an amber glow over the wooden walls. Eli sat in his old armchair. Sophie lay curled in his lap, still hugging her bear. On Eli's legs rested a picture frame. It held the photo of Emily, the little girl who had once filled that space in his life, and who had quietly slipped into the past. "Would you like to hear a story about Emily?" he asked gently. Sophie nodded. "She loved to dance," Eli began, his voice slow and gentle like a quiet prayer. "Every morning, she'd play music, brush her hair, and sway like a real ballerina." "Do you feel sad when you remember her?" Sophie asked, her voice unusually tender. "I do," Eli answered, "but not like before. Back then, remembering her drained everything out of me. Now, when I look at you, when you draw, when you say, 'I love you, Dad,' I feel like Emily is still here somewhere, smiling." Sophie didn't say a word. She looked up and wrapped her arms around Eli's neck. "I'm not Emily," she said slowly, "but could I carry a little piece of her light?" Eli pulled her closer. "You don't need to replace anyone. You are you. And that's more than enough to make me grateful every single day." Outside, the rain had stopped. The night sky was deep and dark, but it wasn't frightening. On the porch, the yellow light still glowed. Not to light the path, but to remind Eli and Sophie that no matter how far they had drifted, they had found their way back to each other and had begun again under one quiet roof. Early morning in Whispering Pines Ridge was quiet. No car horns, no hurried footsteps, just the gentle sound of wind brushing through the leaves, the earthy scent of damp grass after a night of rain, and the occasional chirp of birds, like a soft promise whispered into the new day. The first beams of sunlight slowly spilled onto the ground, filtering through the narrow gaps between trees, as if someone had just opened a window to let the light in. Eli Morgan wore a worn-out turtleneck sweater, his hair still tousled. Inside the cabin, Sophie Blake was brushing her teeth. She had started doing everything on her own without needing reminders or coaxing. It was as if, ever since the red thread bracelet had wrapped around her small wrist, she understood. Some things are protected not through words, but through action. "Mr. Eli, where are we going today?" Sophie stepped out wearing pale gray canvas shoes, her hair tied to one side, holding a small pouch filled with pine cones she'd collected the day before. "We're going for a walk along the forest edge, not too far," Eli said gently, placing his hand on her shoulder. They walked slowly along a trail blanketed in dry leaves. Each step felt deliberate, as if trying not to disturb some slumbering memory buried beneath the earth. Sophie occasionally bent down to pick up more pine cones, quietly adding them to her pouch. Eli didn't urge her to move faster. In that silence, it was as if they were having a conversation made not of words, but of trust, presence, and something unnameable that held them together. When they returned to the cabin, Eli led Sophie to the door at the end of the hallway, the room he hadn't dared to enter for years. It used to belong to Emily, his late daughter, but since Sophie had come, that room no longer held only sorrow. It had become a space of light. Every crayon mark on the wall, every neatly arranged pillow, every brightly colored hair clip scattered on the desk made the room feel alive again. Eli carefully pulled a wooden box from the shelf, as if holding a piece of his own heart. He sat down on the wool rug beside the bed and opened the lid. Inside was a piece of deep purple velvet cloth. Wrapped in it was a simple bracelet made of red thread and faded plastic beads. It had been on Emily's wrist through all of her childhood until her very last day. Sophie sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the bracelet. When Eli gently took her hand and slipped it on her wrist, her small hand trembled just a little. "Was it Emily's?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, full of reverence. Eli nodded, not trusting himself to speak without his voice breaking. "Is it mine now?" "No, it's still hers," he replied. Then, after a pause, added softly and sincerely, "But she wants you to keep it safe." Sophie looked down, holding her wrist close. In her deep brown eyes, something shifted. Not sorrow, not joy, but understanding. A kind of wisdom only children who've walked through darkness seem to carry. That afternoon, Eli worked in his wood shop. He searched for old pieces of wood left over from the chest he once built for Emily, cutting and sanding each edge with care. Sophie sat nearby, helping to wipe down the boards with soft cotton cloth. She didn't ask what he was building. She simply helped, as if sensing that what was taking shape came not just from his hands, but from something deeper inside him. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Eli affixed a wooden sign to the front porch. The carving was done by hand, each letter shaped with a pocket knife, careful and heartfelt. Casa de Luz, the House of Light. He fastened it with 2 copper nails, each strike like a quiet promise, hammered into his own chest. He didn't need anyone else to see it. It was enough that Sophie knew that this place, from now on, belonged to her, and no one could take that away. That evening, after a simple dinner, Sophie sat by the window, resting her chin in her hand as she gazed into the night. The oil lamp cast a soft glow on the ceiling. Eli sat at the table, writing a few notes for Pastor Green and Clara Del Bosque. Suddenly, Sophie turned and whispered, "I think Emily's smiling now." Eli looked up, his eyes meeting the clear gaze of the little girl. After a long pause, he set down his pen, stood, and walked over to sit beside her. He didn't say anything. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder and murmured, almost too softly to hear, "So am I." At last, after everything, the little house in the woods glowed again. Not from wealth, not from some miracle, but because kindness, patience, and quiet love had pieced together a home from what once seemed too broken to mend. Eli was no hero. He was just a man who had been hurt long enough to understand that some pain needs to be held, not solved. And Sophie, the small girl once left behind, had chosen to believe in light. In a world that sometimes seems to reward cruelty, there are still courtrooms where justice speaks, lamps that don't go out, and people who choose to stay. Do you believe that sometimes the ones who enter our lives quietly are the greatest gifts we'll ever receive? Have you ever had to choose between forgiveness and letting go? Have you ever kept a small object because it reminded you that you were once loved? Has a child's hug ever given you the strength to rise again? If this story touched any corner of your heart, I invite you to share. And to everyone who stayed with us until the end, thank you, truly. Please leave a comment, a piece of your own story, or simply write, "I still believe in kindness," because maybe, just maybe, your words will be the light someone else needs to find their way home.